Title: The Unexplained Disturbance. Main story: Michael Black was a 31-year-old police officer from California, USA. He had always been interested in the paranormal and the unexplained, which had led him to study at London University. He had seen and experienced things that many others would not believe, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen. Sabrina Robertson was a 26-year-old medical responder from Miami. She was a stunningly beautiful blonde-haired girl who had graduated from the EMT school with flying colors. She was always calm under pressure, which made her the perfect candidate for the job. Michael and Sabrina had never met, but fate had brought them together in a way that neither of them could have ever imagined. It all started when Michael received a call from dispatch about a disturbance in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. As he arrived on the scene, he noticed that the place had an eerie and ominous feel to it. The door was ajar, and the only light came from the moon, casting ominous shadows all around. As Michael stepped inside, he could hear faint whispers and murmurs. He could feel a cold chill creeping up his spine, and goosebumps covered his arms. Suddenly, he heard a loud thud, and a figure appeared in front of him. It was Sabrina, who had also been called to the warehouse. She looked equally spooked and asked Michael if he had heard anything strange. Michael nodded, and they both decided to investigate. As they walked further inside, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows became more sinister. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream, which echoed through the entire warehouse. They followed the sound to the basement, where they found a room with an old chair and an antique mirror. Sabrina felt a strong urge to sit in the chair, and as she did, the mirror began to glow. Michael tried to pull her out, but it was too late. Sabrina had been possessed by a malevolent spirit. Michael tried to flee, but the warehouse had turned into a labyrinthine maze, and he found himself running in circles. Every time he turned a corner, he would see the same figure, a woman with a twisted face and jagged teeth. She was always just out of reach, but he could feel her breath on the back of his neck. Finally, Michael found himself back in the basement, where he saw Sabrina standing motionless, still possessed. Suddenly, the woman appeared in front of him, and Michael realized that it was her all along. She had used Sabrina as a vessel to lure him into the warehouse, and now she had him trapped. The woman revealed that she had been trapped in the antique mirror for centuries and that she needed a human host to escape. Michael realized that he was her ticket out, and he knew that he had to stop her. In a desperate attempt to save himself and Sabrina, Michael grabbed a nearby axe and smashed the mirror. The woman let out a deafening scream, and Sabrina collapsed onto the ground. As Michael helped Sabrina to her feet, he noticed that the warehouse had returned to its original state, with no signs of the paranormal activity that had taken place. Michael and Sabrina hugged each other tightly, grateful to be alive. They both realized that they had experienced something beyond explanation, and they knew that they would never forget that night. As they left the warehouse, they knew that they had formed a bond that could never be broken, forged by a terrifying experience that they had shared. As they stepped out of the warehouse, Michael and Sabrina were met by a crowd of police officers and emergency responders. They were surprised to see the two of them alive and well, considering the danger of the call. Michael and Sabrina recounted their experiences to their colleagues, but they could tell that nobody believed them. They were dismissed as being under the influence of the atmosphere in the warehouse, and their accounts were written off as hallucinations. Michael and Sabrina knew that they had seen something real, and they couldn't just forget about it. They decided to keep in touch and investigate the paranormal on their own time, away from the prying eyes of their colleagues. Months went by, and the memory of the haunted warehouse began to fade. Michael and Sabrina had not encountered any paranormal activity since then, and they were beginning to believe that their experience was a one-time occurrence. But that all changed one night when Michael received a call from Sabrina. She had been on a routine medical call when she stumbled upon an abandoned hospital. The hospital was rumored to be haunted, and Sabrina wanted to investigate. Michael agreed to join her, and they both headed to the hospital. As they stepped inside, they could feel a strong presence, and they knew that they were not alone. They walked through the empty hallways, feeling the weight of the past. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash, and they ran towards the source of the sound. They found themselves in a room with a single bed, and on the bed lay a young girl with long, dark hair. She was unconscious and had no signs of injury. Michael and Sabrina tried to wake her, but she remained unresponsive. Suddenly, the room began to shake, and the lights flickered on and off. Michael and Sabrina realized that they had walked into a trap, and they were now at the mercy of the spirits that haunted the hospital. The young girl began to stir, and her eyes slowly opened. She looked at Michael and Sabrina, and they could see a glint of something in her eyes. Suddenly, her face twisted into a grotesque, contorted mask, and she let out a bone-chilling scream. Michael and Sabrina knew that they had to leave, and they ran towards the exit. But the door was locked, and they were trapped. The young girl, possessed by a malevolent spirit, was now blocking their only escape. Michael and Sabrina knew that they were in grave danger, and they had to think fast. Suddenly, Sabrina remembered an old spell that she had learned from her grandmother, a spell to banish evil spirits. She began to chant the spell, and Michael joined in. The young girl let out a blood-curdling scream, and the walls began to shake. Suddenly, there was a bright flash of light, and the young girl was gone. Michael and Sabrina ran towards the exit, and this time the door was unlocked. They stepped outside, and they could feel a sense of relief wash over them. They had survived yet another brush with the supernatural. As they walked away from the haunted hospital, Michael and Sabrina knew that they had found their calling. They would continue to investigate the paranormal, and they would help those who had been affected by it. They both realized that their experiences had brought them closer together, and they knew that they would always have each other's backs. They had become a team that was willing to face the unknown together. As Michael and Sabrina walked away from the haunted hospital, they both took deep breaths of the cool night air, still trying to calm their nerves from what they had just experienced. They looked at each other and shared a relieved smile, knowing that they had just faced their greatest challenge yet. They decided to head to a nearby cafe to discuss what had just happened and make sense of it all. As they sat down at a table with cups of hot coffee in front of them, they both recounted what they had seen and felt inside the hospital. Sabrina was the first to speak up. "I can't believe what we just experienced. That girl, she was possessed. And that feeling of being trapped, it was like we were in a nightmare." Michael nodded, his eyes still wide with shock. "I know, I never thought I'd encounter something like that again. But it's like we're being drawn to these places, like it's our calling to help." Sabrina agreed. "I feel the same way. I never imagined that I'd be investigating the paranormal, but now I can't imagine doing anything else." As they talked, they both felt a sense of excitement and purpose building inside them. They knew that they had a long journey ahead of them, but they were ready to face whatever came their way. Suddenly, they were interrupted by a phone call from their captain. He told them that there had been reports of strange activity in an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, and he needed them to investigate. Michael and Sabrina looked at each other and knew what they had to do. They quickly finished their coffee and headed out to their car, ready to face the unknown once again. As they drove towards the factory, they could feel a sense of trepidation building inside them. They both knew that this could be their most dangerous investigation yet, but they also knew that they had to go through with it. As they arrived at the factory, they could see that it was even more rundown and abandoned than they had expected. The windows were boarded up, and the walls were covered in graffiti. But there was also something eerie about the place, like it was alive with an energy that they couldn't explain. They stepped out of their car and cautiously approached the factory. As they got closer, they could hear strange noises coming from inside, like whispers and creaking metal. Sabrina turned to Michael. "Are you ready for this?" Michael nodded, his hand on his weapon. "Let's do this." They entered the factory, and immediately, they could feel the presence of something sinister. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, and they could hear footsteps echoing in the distance. As they made their way through the dark corridors, they suddenly heard a loud bang. They turned a corner, and their worst fears were confirmed. There, standing in front of them, was a group of figures dressed in black robes. They were holding candles and chanting in an unknown language. And in the center of the circle was a young girl, with long dark hair, who looked eerily familiar. Michael and Sabrina knew that they had to act fast. They drew their weapons and yelled at the group to stop what they were doing. But the figures didn't stop. Instead, they began to move towards Michael and Sabrina with a menacing look in their eyes. A fierce battle ensued, with Michael and Sabrina fighting for their lives against the group of figures. The girl in the center of the circle seemed to be the source of the evil energy, and they knew that they had to stop her. Sabrina remembered the banishing spell that she had used before, and she began to chant it again. Michael joined in, and the figures let out blood-curdling screams as they were pushed back by the power of the spell. The girl in the center of the circle began to convulse, and suddenly, she let out a piercing scream. Then, everything went silent. Michael and Sabrina looked around, and all they could see were the black robes scattered on the ground. The girl was gone, and the factory was eerily quiet. As they made their way out of the factory, Michael and Sabrina couldn't help but feel a sense of relief and accomplishment. They had faced their greatest challenge yet and had emerged victorious. But as they drove away from the factory, they both knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more investigations, more battles, and more unknown horrors waiting for them in the darkness. As they looked out into the night sky, they knew that they had found their calling. They were the ones who would face the darkness head-on, and they were ready for whatever came their way. The end.